Before the 1400s, the global economy was a series of vibrant but highly localized exchanges. Goods like spices, textiles, and silk traveled vast distances, but they did so through point-to-point handoffs along the Silk Road and the Indian Ocean trade networks. Western Europe sat at the absolute end of this supply chain. Every time a shipment of pepper or cinnamon changed hands, local merchants and Muslim middlemen added transit fees. By the time those goods reached Venetian ports, European buyers were paying an exorbitant premium that drained their local treasuries. European sailors pushed into the open ocean because their home economies were reaching a breaking point. Securing direct oceanic routes was an act of survival, driven by the need to bypass those middlemen and reach the source of Eastern wealth directly. This geographic breakthrough secured the trade route, and in doing so, it dismantled the old localized system of exchange, forcing a new global logic onto the entire planet. This graphic shows the Columbian Exchange, the result of permanent transoceanic links established by explorers like da Gama and Columbus. These voyages forced Europe, Africa, and the Americas into a sudden, massive cycle of physical transfer. This contact triggered a process called commodification. Local plants, native rituals, and human beings were stripped of their cultural meaning and reclassified as standardized monetary units that could be bought and sold in a global market. Items like ceremonial chicha beer in the Andes or beaver pelts harvested by Algonquian hunters in North America lost their local significance. Instead, they became globalized fuel used to power European markets. Physical contact across the Atlantic forced European powers to invent a ruthless economic operating system to control and manage this resulting flood of commodities. That operating system was mercantilism. It relied on the assumption that the world contained a strict limit to its total wealth. If England's piece of the economic pie grew, Spain's or France's piece had to shrink to accommodate it. A nation's strength was measured by the literal weight of its bullion, the hard gold and silver stockpiled in its treasury. To hoard that bullion, a nation had to maintain a favorable balance of trade. The strategy was to export more high-value goods than you imported, ensuring more money flowed into the country than flowed out. Because wealth was viewed as a zero-sum game, buying goods from a rival empire was seen as a direct surrender of national power. To avoid bleeding wealth to their enemies, European nations built their own closed-loop supply networks. This is where the colonial blueprint comes in. As this text from an Afro-American Studies manual explains, the economic strategy was to make the colonies non-manufacturing dependencies, meant exclusively to secure raw materials. The colonial economy was a forced loop. Settlements in the Americas harvested cheap raw goods like tobacco or sugar and shipped them to the mother country. The mother country then manufactured finished products and sold them back to the colonists at a markup. Trading with other nations was strictly forbidden. Keeping the profit margins high on those raw materials required a brutal labor strategy. It drove the expansion of the transatlantic slave trade, relying on the permanent enslavement of African people to push extraction costs to zero. These colonies were not designed as thriving, independent societies. They were highly engineered mechanisms built to siphon wealth steadily upward to European capitals. Executing this monopoly on a global scale required enormous capital. To manage the cost, merchants and monarchs developed the Joint Stock Company. Organizations like the Dutch West India Company allowed elites to pool their money and share the risks of overseas expansion. These corporations operated with state-like authority. As shown in this rendering of a coastal fort, they built heavily armed outposts to defend their trade routes and enforce their monopolies against competing empires. State-sanctioned military power and corporate profit turned cities like Amsterdam into hubs of global capital. The investors trading shares in these courtyards were reaping the returns of a worldwide extraction network. By pairing colonial resource extraction with protected corporate monopolies, European leaders believed they had constructed an unbreakable machine for generating wealth. These economic theories eventually hardened into aggressive legislation. In the 1650s, the British Parliament passed the Navigation Acts to tighten its grip on its overseas possessions. The restrictions were absolute. Valuable colonial goods like sugar, tobacco, and indigo could only be transported on English ships crewed by English sailors, and they could only be sold directly to England or other English colonies. But the mercantilist machine had a design flaw. The Atlantic world was too vast for any government in London to perfectly monitor thousands of miles of coastline. This distance led to an era of salutary neglect. British officials often ignored colonial mariners who smuggled molasses and raw materials, trading illicitly with French and Dutch merchants for better prices. The harder the empire squeezed to maintain its zero-sum monopoly, the more it trained the colonies to operate outside of it. When the British eventually tried to close these loopholes and collect their tax revenue, the friction between imperial restrictions and colonial desires for open commerce ignited revolutionary conflicts. The dismantling of these closed loops paved the way for the domestic industries and free trade policies of the 19th century. European empires tried to hoard the resources of the globe by treating wealth as a limited prize. Ultimately, the system they built to monopolize the world provided the pressure that created the interconnected capitalist markets we navigate today.